On June 26, 1988, thousands of people gathered for a public air show at the Habsheim Aerodrome, near the small town of the same name in France. One of the most anticipated attractions was a low-altitude flyover by Air France's new Airbus A32111. This state-of-the-art aircraft initially dazzled the crowd with an incredibly low and slow pass, but then, to the horror of everyone present, it failed to climb at the end of the runway. The enormous plane crashed head-on into a forest, disappearing among the trees and triggering an immense explosion of smoke and flames. When the European manufacturer Airbus announced its plans in 1984 for the A320, a 150-seat airplane with cutting-edge technology, purchase orders quickly followed. Air France, France's flag carrier, was the first to acquire it and thus the first to receive an A32111 when they began rolling off the production line in 1988. There was great interest in this new aircraft. Besides its sleek design, it featured impressive technology that until then had only been seen on military jets. The A320 used fly-by-wire technology. This meant that instead of the flight controls being mechanically linked to the parts of the plane they controlled, the pilot's commands were transmitted electronically through a sophisticated computer that acted as an intermediary. This system could make flying easier and safer. For example, the computer could automatically adjust the control surfaces to prevent the aircraft from stalling, and even ignore the pilot's commands if those commands put the airplane in danger. Air France was eager to show off its new acquisition, and one of the chosen places to do so was the Habsheim Air Show. This annual event attracted thousands of people, including many journalists. It was the perfect setting to demonstrate the capabilities of the new A320. At that time, Air France had already received 3 aircraft of this model. The newest one, which had been in service only a few days, was selected to participate in the show, along with 2 experienced pilots from the airline. Captain Michel Asselineau, 44, had conducted numerous test flights with the new A320s. He was accompanied by First Officer Pierre Mazière, 45. Both had more than 10,000 flight hours each. On the day of the show, June 26, 1988, the plane took off from Basel-Mulhouse-Freiburg Airport, located on the border between Switzerland and Germany. Although it was a demonstration flight, mainly for the public on the ground, the aircraft carried 130 passengers. Many were invited journalists, but there were also local residents, including families who had won their seats in a contest. For all of them, it was going to be a very unusual flight. The plan was for the plane to approach the Habsheim Aerodrome and make 2 very low and slow passes over one of the runways. Then the aircraft would take a scenic flight around Mont Blanc before returning to its home airport. The 2 pilots were confident in the flight plan, especially Captain Asselineau. He told his co-pilot that there was nothing to worry about. "I've done it 20 times before," he assured him. From his point of view, that confidence was not unfounded. After all, the new fly-by-wire technology allowed them to take the plane to its limits on such a low and slow flyover without fear of stalling. The system simply wouldn't allow it. However, shortly after the flight began, things started to get complicated. The pilots were not familiar with Habsheim, and the small aerodrome was not programmed into the flight computer, so they had to locate it visually. When they finally spotted it, they were closer than ideal and had to make a rapid, steep descent to reach the correct altitude for the flyover. In addition, upon approaching, they realised that the crowd of spectators was positioned next to runway 34. They had planned to fly over runway 02, but since there was no audience there, it made no sense to do so. At the last moment, the pilots changed their course to fly over runway 34. As a result of these unforeseen changes, they had very little time to stabilise the aircraft at the correct altitude. The flyover was supposed to take place at about 100 feet, but the plane ended up passing only 30 feet above the ground. Seeing such a large aircraft fly that low was spectacular for the crowd, and at the same time, as thrilling as it was, frightening for the passengers on board. When the plane, flying so low, approached the end of the runway, the pilots were stunned to see a forest rising before them. From above, the treetops had appeared like simple bushes or shrubs, but now it was clear that they were tall enough to pose a deadly danger. Desperate, Captain Asselineau attempted to pull the A320 up sharply, but he noticed that the plane responded sluggishly, and within seconds it was already too late. The aircraft ploughed through the treetops, sucking leaves and branches into the engines, blocking them and causing them to fail. The airplane crashed into the forest, and a gigantic fireball rose above the trees. Upon seeing the explosion, many spectators thought it impossible that anyone could have survived, but fortunately, the fire came from the explosion of a wing that had detached from the fuselage. The main part of the aircraft remained mostly intact, and although the impact was brutal, it managed to come down violently among the trees. The passengers, shaken and injured, tried to evacuate. Many had trouble unbuckling their seatbelts. In the 1980s, flying was not as common as today, and most people were more familiar with car seatbelts, which release with a button rather than a latch. The fire reached the main fuselage, generating smoke and a growing sense of panic. The flight attendants opened the front and rear doors, but the front door was partially blocked by thick branches and leaves. It had to be forced open, which delayed evacuation in that area. Despite that, within minutes, almost all passengers had exited the aircraft. One flight attendant hesitated to leave the plane. She remained at the front door calling out for possible survivors, but no one responded, and the smoke was already so thick she couldn't see anything. Finally, she evacuated. She was the last person to exit alive. In reality, 3 people remained on board. One was 14-year-old Hervé Lehrmann, who used a wheelchair and had no mobility in his arms or legs. Although he almost certainly had survived the initial impact, he could not evacuate. The second victim was 7-year-old Mariama Barry, who became trapped against the seat in front of her when her own seat broke during the crash. She was travelling with her older brother, who tried to help her get out, but he was swept out of the plane by the wave of fleeing passengers, leaving Mariama behind. The third and final victim was Marie-Françoise Fresh, 42. She and her husband had managed to unbuckle their seatbelts and reach an emergency exit, but Marie-Françoise went back to try to rescue Mariama. The smoke overcame her before she could achieve it. The survivors fled into the forest, where they were assisted by emergency vehicles that had been on standby for the airshow, and later by general rescue services. Many people were seriously injured. Almost all suffered smoke inhalation, and a few sustained severe burns. However, everyone who managed to leave the plane ultimately survived the accident. After the crash, the French Bureau of Investigation and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, BEA, launched an investigation. They had an unusually large amount of evidence. Most passengers and both pilots had survived, and the entire sequence of the accident had been recorded by a cameraman filming the airshow. It became clear that the accident had occurred because the plane had flown too low. But the question was why? Part of the reason was poor planning. The pilots had not received a detailed flight plan before the day of the event. In fact, the plan they were given had been hastily assembled only a day before the show, using maps that did not show the forest at the end of runway 34. That plan indicated that the flyover should be done at 100 feet, an altitude lower than allowed by regulations, but not one that should have caused an accident. However, the rapid descent into Habsheim and the last-minute course change to fly over runway 34 left very little margin to properly stabilise the altitude. They ended up flying much lower than planned. They should have been alerted by the instruments and by an altitude alarm in the cockpit, but Captain Asseline stated that the alarm was barely audible over the noise of the plane, and that the digital screens were difficult to read at a glance. He also claimed that the aircraft responded sluggishly when he attempted the emergency climb at the last second, and that it even gave him the impression that the nose was lowering instead of rising. The investigators examined the new fly-by-wire system in detail and discovered that it had indeed overridden Captain Asseline's commands, pitching the nose downward instead of upward at the critical moment. But this had not caused the accident. The system was functioning correctly by preventing the aircraft from stalling. Had it not intervened, the plane likely would have crashed into the forest anyway. Final responsibility therefore fell on the pilots, Air France, and the organisers of the airshow. 5 people, including both pilots, were found guilty of involuntary manslaughter. Most received severe sentences, and Captain Asseline was sentenced to 10 months in prison for his role in the disaster. After this accident, passengers were never again allowed on demonstration flights, and pilots assigned to fly them were required to receive additional training to do so safely. In France, seatbelts were redesigned so that they could be unfastened with a single action, and from then on, every flight included a visual demonstration of how to unfasten them. On Airbus aircraft, low-altitude alarms were modified to be much more audible to pilots, making the sound feed directly into their headsets rather than just the general cockpit. Low-altitude flyovers are still occasionally performed at air shows, but now they are planned, reviewed, and controlled with extreme care to ensure that lives are never again put at risk in order to showcase an airplane.